I got into a Twitter battle with some white nationalists, and that was an experience. But what I ended up discovering was that they were articulating something that I think a lot of white people are feeling but are afraid to say. Right? Some of them articulate it in this question, is it okay to be white? Or sometimes as a statement, right? It's okay to be white. And I've seen posts to this effect, and I wanted to discuss the underlying concepts in that question, that statement, is it okay to be white? And I think the answer, in sort of like traditionally annoying philosophical move, is it really depends on what you mean by white. And I think that there are positive ways to define what whiteness is, and there are negative ways to define what whiteness is. And neither is correct. We actually need both to really wrap our heads around it. So I wanted to make this video, the sort of framework that I'm thinking about this is meant to be a conversation and not a production, right? I'm not going to try and throw a bunch of stuff at you as if I know like some kind of abstract moral truth about it. I just want to articulate some realizations that I had because I think that this framework of thinking could be useful to certain people. Okay. How are we going to do this? 4 things. Is it okay to be white? An anecdote about skiing, some talk about colonialism, an old dude called Hegel, and then back to the Twitter, but different people than the white nationalists. A professor of mine from Hendrix brought up the idea to me that whiteness is kind of the default setting for a lot of people, right? One of the things that you know as depending on where you grew up, very much depending on where you grew up, whiteness is sort of the default setting in such a way that you never have to become aware of the fact that you're white unless someone brings it to your attention. Right? So he said one of the great things that living in a neighborhood that's different from where you grew up is because you can sometimes become aware of your whiteness. This happened to me a little when I moved to Brooklyn, right? I was sometimes the only white person on a train, and I all of a sudden had to become aware of the fact that I was white. And that's not, it sounds really silly, but like when you walk around and your understanding is that like you live in the default setting, you don't have to think about that because it's just the default setting. We don't celebrate like a white male who gets cast in a role in a Hollywood film because the default setting is that white roles get cast as protagonists in Hollywood films. So with that in mind, a skiing anecdote. Over spring break, I went to a place that was super meaningful to my own family. It wasn't a like bougie ski resort with a spa and all this jazz, but it was a mountain that meant a lot to my own family. My uncles were there that I almost never see. My dad was there, and he went there all the time when he was younger. And normally I'm a garbage skier, but I kind of locked it in this time around, and I had this experience of like being part of this aspect of my family's history that I didn't expect and didn't anticipate. And I very much remember standing in the parking lot after the fact, and I just sort of had this moment when I thought that I was so grateful that I got to experience this part of my family's history. And like nerd that I am, I was sitting around thinking about how this could function personally as a positive definition of what it means to be me as a white person in the United States. That's not a statement about who should ski or what. It's just, but like that. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say was in terms of personality, personal history. I experienced that this place and this activity was something that was meaningful to my family's history. And it built for me for a moment of clarity in terms of positively defining who I am and my own history. And why those positive definitions are necessary and useful is because a lot of times in the conversation of whiteness in America, they occur with the backdrop of the reality of colonial history. And I mean, I hope that statement's transparent enough, but we took this country from Native Americans. We've taken over so many places. Unhealthy colonial power relations are baked into the history of the United States of America. One of the larger problems that seems to be occurring right now is that we seem to be under the illusion as a nation that those unhealthy power relations of the past are gone. The Obama post-racial myth is the language that people use to describe this, right? Those negative definitions, the colonial aspect of whiteness, right? This is what the tweet that I referred to earlier was mentioning, right? Someone said diversity is an attack on whiteness as a tweet. And then the response was, only if by whiteness you mean, and then she mentioned this, like the power structures that run society. Both of those concepts are necessary, right? Recognizing a positive definition of whiteness in terms of your own history, and then also recognizing the negative history that has led to where we are. Okay. I want to note that this rationalization, this recognition of identity can apply to gender as well as to sexuality, right? So often often traditional masculinity in the United States is defined negatively, right? The concept of maleness is not femaleness, right? Don't be weak, don't be emotional like a girl, don't be a bitch, so there's all these different ways that we socialize young boys, that the way to become a man is to become not a weaker, less powerful woman. And this brings me to that old dude, right? So Hegel, a German philosopher, kind of generalized this in a dialectic that is called the Master Slave Dialectic. There's different translations of those words, but essentially the generalization of this concept is that there are people in power, and there are people without power, and this happens a lot in history, right? So you can apply this to gender, you can apply this to race, or you can apply this to any situation, even a boss and a coworker, a boss and an employee, any situation where there is a power imbalance. And what Hegel recognizes is that people crave positive definitions of themselves, right? The master, just like the slave, wants a positive, independent self-consciousness. He or she wants to be able to wake up, he usually, in this dialectic, wants to wake up and say, I am who I am, positively. Right? And because the master has power, and this is part of the inside of the dialectic, right? Because the master has power, the colonizer, the male, whoever, he attempts to find that identity in his oppressive relationship with the other. So the master tries to positively define himself in terms of his power relationship over another person. And Hegel scholars don't nail me. I know I'm glossing over details, and I haven't read this in years, but the essential concept here is that the master can never win. He can never find his independent self-consciousness if he's attempting to define himself in terms of the power relationships that he has to others. And this is where my memory will fail me a little, but I believe at the end of the dialectic, the master and the slave part ways. And it's the slave that leaves with the independent self-consciousness, and the master is left sort of desperate and alone and without ground to stand on, because the ground of his identity was based on stepping on other people. And when those other people are gone, you have nothing left to stand on. We can recast the question of negative and positive definitions of whiteness in terms of this dialectic. Like, are you going to define yourself in terms of having power over another person? Or are you going to define yourself positively in terms of other elements of your life? And I think it's answering that question that we can feel the emotions like start to rise. Because if someone says black people should have power, equal power, that shouldn't threaten you, right? There should be no emotions of being threatened unless your concept of your own identity, your concept of whiteness, is based on negative relations. If what you mean by white is not black, I am white because I am not like these people who have less power, then of course the process of empowering someone is going to make you feel threatened, because that's how human psychology works and that's how power works. But if your definition of yourself is independent of oppressive relationships, which it probably can't be, for reasons I'll get to in a minute, but if you have this sort of perfectly independent concept of yourself, then empowering a person, increasing justice for the world, shouldn't make you feel threatened at all. So that's kind of where I want to challenge you. If you're listening to this video, if you're still here, are you going to define yourself positively, or are you going to define yourself negatively? And that question in of itself, I think, is actually, I want to say it's a poorly formed question, because I think the reality is we can't escape history. We can't look back at the past and say, I'm going to define myself in terms of only the components of the past that I recognize as positive. maybe you can intellectually do that, you can emotionally do that, reflectively you can say, oh, I was not a colonizer, and therefore colonial history is not part of who I am. But the only reason you can make that move is because the negative effects of colonial history are not affecting you right now. That is one way of framing what privilege is, right? The ability to alter history, the ability to remove components of history and still have a positive definition left over. Anyway, I want to close this by bringing it back to a different Twitter dialogue that I saw. And this was by a science or philosophy, I can't remember, professor who was black, and she was talking about her experience in graduate school seminars and how as a black woman, she was often interrupted. As a woman in graduate school, she was often interrupted. And rather than her fellow graduate students saying to the professor, hey, I feel like you're unfairly treating this woman, and causing a big fuss right in the moment, what this guy would do consistently as an ally was he would just direct the conversation back to her. He would say, oh, I thought you weren't finishing, or I didn't think you had finished that point, or what were you saying about this, or I didn't fully understand what you said about this. And in a there was no violent confrontation or anything in this moment, he was still able to sort of give her due portion of the conversation. That's where I want to cycle back to Hegel, and give me a second to try and translate this into English here, out of Hegel, even in English isn't in English. There's two ways to find identity, right? You could have a positive definition, or dialectically, right, you can negate the negation. So if your concept of whiteness is based on an unhealthy power relationship, you can't break yourself free from that without negating it. And that's what being an ally is, right? Being an ally is saying, I'm going to embrace the fact that I'm a white person. I'm going to embrace the fact that I have benefited from systematic racism in one way or another, even if I didn't individually cause it. But even as I recognize that I have benefited from these, I'm going to use the power that I have to help the people that do not have it. That's part of what being an ally is. And so that's what I mean when I say that you have to have both. You have to have a positive definition of whiteness. You have to look back at your own history and you have to say, I'm Irish, or I'm German, or I'm British, and I have these roots, and I have this history, and I have these things that matter to me as a person. But that can't be the only thing that you hold on to as your definition. There has to be a recognition of the negative aspects of our history, and the only perhaps healthy way to do that without furthering racial injustice is to recognize that component of history and then fight against it. Is it okay to be white? That answer is contingent on how you're going to choose to define what whiteness is. I can't create a definition. I'm not going to be the owner of what that definition is. Every individual person can define their own history in their own way, right? In terms of how they choose to relate to that history. But what is true is that there are aspects of our history that are intrinsically related to colonialism, and there are aspects of our history that are intrinsically positive and have no negative effects on other people. We need to recognize both of those, positively hold on to the good ones that are there, and then actively negate the negative ones to move this world towards more justice. So is it okay to be white? It's kind of up to you. Hey, so thanks for watching. I hope this was useful to at least one person. The two things, right? One, I haven't uploaded in forever, been working on graduate school stuff. Two, I'm not an expert in any of this, so if you disagree, you know someone who has a better opinion, go for it. Throw it in the comments, let me know, shoot me a message. I would rather articulate something imperfectly than wait to have a perfect articulation. One, because I never find it, and two, even if I did, it wouldn't convince everyone. Actually, sorry, a fourth thing. If you, I might throw a transcription of this on a website that I'm slowly building. I might also just start exporting audio from these to podcast. I don't really think that having my face talking adds a lot to some of these kinds of videos, right? Some of them are necessary to have visuals, but not stuff like this. So if you're interested in hearing this kind of stuff just in audio format, let me know, and I'll try and make that happen. And then also, if you're interested in seeing that website, I can put the link up, but it's very much under construction, so I'm not circulating it yet. All right, I'm going to go negate the negation, and I will talk to you guys in the next one.